Well, good evening and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. My name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director here at CIS. For those of you who aren't familiar with CIS, we're a public policy research organisation that's primarily committed to promoting the principles of classical liberalism, individual freedom, limited democratic government, productivity-enhancing reform, promoting literacy and numeracy in our primary schools, and not least defending the institutions that have helped make this nation great. For many decades now, CIS has been a major participant in the public policy debates in Canberra and across the country, but we've tried to do so in a way that speaks above the toxic polarisation that all too often characterises public discourse in this country and in many parts of the Western world. Now, when we advertised this event about a month or so ago, the subject originally was going to be on immigration. But given the tumultuous events in Canberra during the course of the last week that culminated in the changing of prime ministers in the federal government, we thought we'd have a more general discussion about the landscape, the political landscape in Canberra and the broad body politic. Tony Abbott, of course, was Prime Minister of our country from 2013 to 2015. He was the leader of the Federal Liberal Party from 2009 to 2015. And since 1994, he has been the federal member for the electorate of Warringah. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Abbott.
Thanks, mate. Good on you, Tom. Well, thanks, Tom. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be amongst so many great Australians. I'm particularly pleased that my state parliamentary colleague Damien Tudorhope is here. I'm delighted that the former chairman of my Economic Advisory Council, Maurice Newman, is here. And I'm told that the former long-serving Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Max Moore-Wilton, is here. So I realise that I am amongst my elders and betters and hopefully will behave myself on that score. Look, I want to express my hope and confidence that politics today is in better shape than it was just a few days ago. I think that our polity will be far less toxic in the near future than it has been in the recent past, and I think that will be good for all of us. Certainly it will be good for the Liberal Party and it will be good for our country. I should say, in defence of my friend and colleague Peter Dutton, that he was a most reluctant challenger last week, a most reluctant challenger. Just as I was back in 2009, Peter Dutton last week was someone who above all else wanted to change policy, not to change leader. And I am confident, given the remarks of new Prime Minister Scott Morrison, I am confident, given the ministerial appointments that he's made, that there will be better policy, there will be a united party, and there will be a sharper difference with our opponents. The new Energy Minister is Angus Taylor, and we all know that Angus Taylor is not only a man of fine character, but a man of deep common sense and experience in this area. I am confident, as the Prime Minister says, that policy will be run to cut price, not to cut emissions. Emissions are not irrelevant, but the important thing is to get price down and to let emissions look after themselves. And I'm also confident with Alan Tudge in a new population role, and he has been a sensible and sensitive speaker on this subject over recent months, that immigration will go more closely hand in hand with integration, and in particular, the stress for all primary applicants will be on having a job and joining our team and making a contribution from day one. And this will make a good government better. And I want to stress that this has been a good government. Our borders have been secured. Our trade has been strengthened. Our taxes have been reduced. Our spending has been disciplined, and we will be better in the future than we have been in the recent past, because the government is now in that sensible centre-right, liberal conservative mainstream, so well described by John Howard just a few years ago when he said that the centre of gravity of our party is to be economically liberal and socially conservative. I think that Prime Minister Morrison very much appreciates that successful politics is always based on good values. And as I've often said, again echoing John Howard, that as Liberals, we believe in smaller government, lower taxes and greater freedom. As Conservatives, we believe in the family, small business and values and institutions that have stood the test of time. But above all else, as patriots, we want our country to be stronger, based on what we know works and on the great strengths that have made us who and what we are. And this is why there are some constants in the policies of Liberal National Coalition governments. Lower taxes, less red tape, a tight rein on spending, particularly on the establishment of new programs, because we all know that once a program is in place, it develops a constituency and it's very, very difficult then ever to change, let alone to repeal. Strong borders, a strong and effective military, strong alliances. In education, excellence. In healthcare, choice. And when it comes to social security, we want the system to be more like a trampoline than a hammock. That's always been our approach, and certainly that will be our approach in the future under Scott Morrison. So, I think that the policy contest will be sharper. And I think that's important, because when you look around the world, things are becoming more divided, not less. When you look around the world, political differences are widening, not narrowing. And if I may say so, one of our mistakes in recent times has been seeking a false consensus rather than prosecuting a real contest. Look around the world, as I say. Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader the British Labor Party has ever had. Bernie Sanders, the only avowed socialist ever elected to the US Congress, as far as I'm aware, almost won the Democratic Party nomination for the recent election. Now, I don't for a second say that Bill Shorten is in and of himself nearly as left-wing as that. I know Bill Shorten well, and if he had his way, I'm sure he would be a mainstream Labor leader. The trouble is, his political insecurity has, shall I say, made his principles flexible. And we don't need a Prime Minister whose economic policy strings are being pulled by the thugs of the CFMEU. We do not need a Prime Minister whose social policy strings and whose border protection policy strings are being pulled by the Green left. We don't need new taxes on retirees who should not be punished for their hard work and for saving. We don't need new taxes on housing and investment, which will damage our economy at a critical time. We certainly don't need even more renewables. We certainly don't need even higher emissions reductions targets, because that will just put power prices even further through the roof, and that will just drive more jobs offshore. I have to say that I've always thought that in all the vicissitudes of politics, what counted for most is character. Scott Morrison has a strong and a good character. And may I express my fond hope that in the weeks and months and years to come, political success will be determined, again, more by character and less by polling. I accept that in this business of politics, people will always disagree. They will disagree within parties as well as disagree between parties. But the contest between parties should be conducted with respect, and the contest within parties should be conducted with honesty. If we disagree, let us do it openly and honestly. Let us never in the future say one thing to someone's face and something totally different behind their backs. That has been the poison in our polity over the last decade of disappointment, and that, above all else, is what must end. I want to close and throw to questions and comments with this famous observation. It's not an observation of John Howard, although there are many lapidary observations of John's that I could cite. It's not an observation of Bob Menzies, our great and illustrious founder, although again, there are many I could cite. It is one of the most famous statements of Australian politics, but I believe it's something that partisans of both sides can savour and cherish. It is those words of Ben Chifley talking about that light on the hill. He said our great objective is not making someone Premier or Prime Minister. It's not putting sixpence more or less in someone's pocket. It is working for the betterment of mankind, not just here, but wherever we can lend a helping hand. I think that is a marvellous encapsulation of the calling of public life. My objective has always been to try by my own efforts and those of my colleagues to help all of us to come closer to being our best selves. And if we can't always be our best selves, at least let us be better. And I am confident that that will be the case as a result of the events of last week.
On the right, mate. On the right. Well, thank you, Tony Abbott. And before we talk about the public policy landscape, we have to turn to politics to start with. Since 2010, we've had 6 prime ministerships. Rudd, Gillard, Rudd, Yu, Turnbull and now Morrison. The BBC has called Canberra the coup capital of the world. How do you account for this rapid turnover in such a short period of time?
I want to make 2 observations, Tom. The first is that despite the goings-on in Canberra, I believe our country has gone forward, even in the last decade of disappointment, because in a country such as ours, we don't look to government for everything. We make our own decisions, we run our own lives, we don't wait for government to tell us what to do. And the Australian people in their decency and wisdom have just got on with it as best they could. Yes, government matters, because in the end we do make the laws, We do set the policies, and it's important that the laws be as good as they can be and the policies be as sensible as they can be. But nevertheless, despite everything, we have gone forward in the last decade. So that's the first observation. Now, I had another observation, but it slipped my mind, given that I haven't got any notes in front of me.
Well, let me volunteer something. You could argue that we've had 27 years of uninterrupted growth.
Yeah.
We've got a very successful immigration policy
Yeah.
that many countries around the world would die for.
Yeah.
Doesn't that indicate that...
I remember what I was going to say. Yes, the past decade has, at least up until now, been a disappointment. But let's not forget that the previous quarter century was really a rather remarkable period. Is it the circumstances that have changed? Is it the characters of the individuals at the top which are different? I don't know. But certainly, as a senior member of the Howard government, I was aware of plenty of disagreements, both across the aisle and on our side of the aisle. And yet, I think there was a degree of respect between Howard and Hawke. There was a degree of respect between Keating and Costello. There was great respect and solidarity inside the senior ranks of the Howard government.
Yes, but to be fair though, Hawke, Keating, Howard, Costello, they never had to deal with this toxic polarisation of Twitter and social media. To what extent has that changed things?
No, look, there is absolutely no doubt that the 24/7 media cycle has made it harder. There is no doubt that the public discourse has coarsened because it's more anonymous than ever before, and anonymity makes vicious cowards of us all if we let ourselves sink to those depths.
Okay, talking about Malcolm Turnbull,
Yeah.
he knifed you in 2015. He's been knifed last week. What distinguished the coups against Malcolm Turnbull from other coups?
Well, again, I don't want to dwell too much on last week. I think the important thing is to learn from last week and to make the most of those lessons. But I reckon that the lessons from last week are: do not persevere in a policy which is causing massive divisions inside your own party room.
So you're talking about the ETS in 2009 and the NEG this time.
And do not light fuses under your own leadership with unnecessary spills.
How do you respond to the prevailing wisdom in much of the media, the Canberra Press Gallery, the ABC, the Guardian, the Fairfax Press, that says that this attempt to dislodge Turnbull, the successful attempt, was driven by the far right base of the Liberal Party that does not in any way, shape or form represent the values of Middle Australia? How do you respond to that prevailing wisdom?
Well, I suppose if you listen to most of those entities, I'm part of the vast right-wing conspiracy, and yet I led the party quite successfully for 4 years in opposition. Won a thumping majority in 2013 on what I thought were clear and strong policies, and then, despite everything, managed to get quite a lot done in 2 years before the polls and various other factors intervened. So, look, I think that there is still a strong political constituency for what might be described as centre-right, liberal, conservative values. They just need to be clearly and intelligently expressed and wholeheartedly believed.
Graham Richardson, the former Labor minister, is writing in the Australian newspaper today, and he says, quote, that under Malcolm Turnbull, the rank and file in the Liberal base has deserted in droves to the point where finding the personnel to man polling booths is now a serious problem. Richardson goes on to say, I'm disappointed to hear the new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, will not be including Tony Abbott in his cabinet. If he had included Abbott, the base would have been impressed and pleased. They would have returned to the fold and all would be forgiven. That was Graham Richardson in today's Australian. Tony Abbott.
Look, I have a bit of time for Graham. He and I have become, I think, friends over the last decade or so, and he's a very shrewd observer. But I think I know the Liberal Party a lot better than he does, and I am very confident that now that we have put the rancour of the last few years behind us, and I am absolutely confident that is the case. I have certainly put any rancour that I may have felt in that box that Kevin Rudd used to call the forgettery, and I am confident that our party rank and file will be coming back in droves.
Okay, well, the Prime Minister has offered...
What happened last week was the worst thing for the Australian Conservatives possible, because all of those people who maybe gave up on us have no reason whatsoever not to rejoin a sensible party of the centre-right that can actually get things done and not just cry in the wilderness.
How do you think Scott Morrison will distinguish himself from Malcolm Turnbull?
I think he's very much a man of the party. He has a long history in the party. He's a former state director of the Liberal Party here in New South Wales. I think he very much appreciates that the first task of leadership is to keep the team together, and the second task of leadership is to give us something to fight for that we believe in. I think he understands that, and that's what he'll get on doing.
Okay, the Prime Minister has offered you a return from exile in a special role of Special Envoy to the Prime Minister in Indigenous Affairs. Now, this would be outside the Cabinet, but according to the Daily Telegraph today in their editorial, this would represent an elevation. Will you accept the Prime Minister's offer to be a Special Envoy to the Prime Minister?
We had a very good conversation about that yesterday, half an hour or so before he announced the ministry, and I certainly think that there is a lot that can and should be done here. I guess I'd like to know more in terms of precisely what he has in mind, because while, as you know, Tom, I've spent a lot of time both as a minister, a shadow minister, an opposition leader, a Prime Minister, and subsequently as a backbencher. I've spent a lot of time in Indigenous Australia, and there is so much to be done. One of the problems, though, that bedevils Indigenous policy more than just about any other area of our public life is governance. I just want to make sure that if I am to do this, I won't be treading on the toes of people who are already there, given that there are so many people already there.
When will you make that decision?
Well, he's thinking about it, I'm thinking about it, and we'll do it as quickly as possible.
John Howard has said all too often that the Liberal Party is a broad church of Liberals and Conservatives, but nevertheless, notwithstanding the new Prime Minister, there are clearly still serious policy divisions in the party room generally. You would have to think, given everything we've experienced over the last week. Let's turn to immigration just briefly. Your border protection policies helped boost public confidence in large-scale non-discriminatory immigration, but in recent times you have called for cutting immigration. Why, when the border protection policies help boost confidence in our immigration system?
It's not so much a cut, more a restoration. I argued for a restoration of the kind of numbers that we saw during the Howard era, as opposed to the absolute record numbers that we've seen over the last decade. Now, that's what I've argued for, and particularly given Alan Tudge's appointment to this new population role, he's the Minister for Congestion Busting. I suspect that we might see some movement there, but again, it's entirely in the hands of the new government, but I'm confident that that's the direction we'll go in.
It seems to me, though, calls for cutting immigration across the Western world have escalated in recent times. Yet no one really in Canberra, on either side of politics at a senior level, is calling for cuts. Why not? When there's polls that clearly indicate supporting cutting immigration.
Well, 2 points. Tom. First, I am a supporter of immigration. I think all of us are supporters of immigration because just about all of us are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. The question is the number and the type. I'm also a supporter of a non-discriminatory immigration program because there are any number of people who come to this country from very diverse backgrounds and become absolutely wonderful Australian citizens. But you can be pro-immigration and pro-migrant without necessarily thinking that the numbers can only ratchet upwards and without necessarily thinking that there's a kind of an unconditional, you've got an unconditional right of entry. As I used to say as PM, we want everyone who comes here to join our team.
Treasury modelling says that
Best way to join the team is to have a job from day one.
Treasury modelling says that migration adds 1% to GDP, and if you cut it, that increases the prospects of a recession that we probably would have had over the last 10 to 15 years. Your response?
Well, it's interesting that you raised that point, Tom, because there is absolutely no doubt that in normal circumstances, immigration does increase overall economic growth, but the impact on GDP per head is not necessarily always as strongly positive. And yes, we haven't had a recession for 27 years if you just look at overall economic growth, but if you look at growth per head, growth per capita, we have had a recession at the time of the global financial crisis. So that was a recession for individuals, even if it wasn't a recession for the economy as a whole. And certainly over the last 5 years, GDP per head has been growing on average at under 1%. And that's one of the reasons why, even though the overall figures look good, people don't feel that their prosperity is increasing. And this in turn drives the discontent, which is now so widespread.
Climate energy policy, it clearly played a prominent role in bringing down 3 prime ministers, Kevin Rudd on the emissions trading scheme, Julia Gillard, the carbon tax, and now arguably Malcolm Turnbull over the National Energy Guarantee. And you won a landslide election in 2013, largely based on a decision to repeal the carbon tax. Many ordinary voters would say, why won't the political elite recognise that you can't decarbonise the economy if it means higher power prices?
And jobs going offshore. Look, this is a very good question, and I have never been a true believer in the green religion. And as time goes by, I suppose I become more and more sceptical. If you look at what energy and climate policies are linked to electoral success, the obvious answer is go in with your focus on what's good for people's cost of living. And that's what I did in 2013. And we had a resounding victory. People said you couldn't do it. They said anyone who questions the climate consensus, in inverted commas, was politically doomed. That was the message from all of the pundits in 2009. Abbott can't win because Abbott questions the climate consensus. Well, we almost did win in 2010, and we had a thumping win in 2013, and I think our position was very strong and constant throughout that period.
Now, you've argued that we should withdraw from the Paris International Agreement on Climate Change. Now, unlike Kyoto, the protocol in 1997, Paris is not legally binding, it's not enforceable, it's not verifiable. So what difference does it make if we stay in Paris?
Because Australian officials, unlike, say, French and Italian officials, are a little bit more respectful of rules. And as long as our people think that there is a moral, if not a legal obligation, they will act as though it is a legal obligation. And we know a lot more now than we did in middle of 2015. Since then, we had the South Australian statewide blackout, which was driven by the increasing fragility of baseload power and the increasing penetration of unreliable intermittent renewable power. And we've also had the US pull out of Paris, and of course we now know that China and India, the first and fourth largest emitters respectively, never signed up for any commitments in Paris.
Some say they're chugging along the smoky path to prosperity.
Well, and if you were a governmental leader in India or China, the one thing you want above all else is to see the benefits of life in a country like this extended to their own citizens. I can remember years and years ago visiting the Soviet Union in the days when that was still extant, and I think I can remember seeing slogans on buildings and bridges, communism equals workers' control plus electrification. They understood. I mean, they got so much wrong, the communists, but at least they understood that electrification is at the heart of modernity. And that means power that actually works when you throw the switch, not that only works if the wind's blowing or the sun's shining.
Culture. We had former Prime Minister John Howard here a couple of months ago, and he reaffirmed his disgust with political correctness and identity politics. Do you think we've got to a stage in this country, and indeed many other parts of the West, where certain subjects can't be discussed openly without inspiring mass hysteria?
That's a good question, Tom. And again, I think the Twitterverse has coarsened debate, no doubt about that. The level of abuse has gone up exponentially thanks to social media and the impact of social media on more mainstream media. This whole quantum of moral outrage, the outrage industry slips into overtime instantly. Someone says something that upsets the commissars of political correctness. I absolutely accept that, but we still have to do what we can. We still have to do what we can, and it grieves me that we now get directives even in the military, so it seems, saying that you can't refer to people as he or she. Well, I mean, really and truly, how do you give an order to it?
You know, on Friday, I was commissioned to write an article about what Scott Morrison should do by, of all people, the Sydney Morning Herald. And they asked me what Morrison should do, and I made the point that we all too often hear about a school or a university or a company either promoting or pandering to a politically correct agenda in the name of diversity. And I called on the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to raise more doubts about this identity politics. Will Scott Morrison do so?
I am confident that he will take a very sensible approach to all these things. And I absolutely agree with you that in the end, the job of a company is not to facilitate social engineering. It is to serve its customers. It is to, within reason, maximise return to shareholders and to be decent to its staff.
In your speech, you made a point of putting these events of the last week in a global context. Trump, Brexit, particularly around Europe, you're witnessing the resurgence of so-called populist movements that threaten to upend political establishments across the Western world. Do you think that we in Australia are at the point where there is a so-called populist movement that wants to rail against the political elite in Canberra, much as what we've seen in Britain, America and Europe in recent times?
I think there are elements of the base of both parties that feel abandoned. I think that the traditional blue-collar worker feels rather neglected by a lot of his or her Labor representatives. And I think the traditional suburban or regional small business person sometimes feels a little neglected by our side of politics. So I think the important thing is, to use a Reaganism, always dance with the one that brung you. But at the same time, you've got to reach out to sensible people on the other side. Hawke did it, Howard did it, for a period I was able to do it, and I think that Scott Morrison will be able to do that.
Judith Sloan, the economist who writes for the Australian newspaper, she said at the weekend, and she, by the way, was here at CIS in a debate. She was on Mark Latham's side, and they carried the day against two economists for slashing immigration. And she argued in the Australian that the key to understanding the forces that effectively have ripped apart the Liberal Party and led to the departure of the Prime Minister is the distinction between what Judith Sloan calls globalism and nationalism. I'll just read this out. Globalism, according to Judith Sloan, involves a commitment to world outcomes, to concern for the welfare of all citizens of the world. In its extreme form, nation states disappear and we are all one big happy family. Judith Sloan goes on to say, nationalism, on the other hand, involves commitment to country with governments primarily concerned about the welfare of their citizens. This often involves a considerable degree of pride in country on the part of citizens and a willingness to defend the borders and its way of life. Tony, where does the Liberal Party sit today?
I have enormous respect for Judith Sloan, who is one of the best commentators we have. Very, very shrewd person, Judith. I would probably talk about patriotism and love of country rather than nationalism. But I certainly think that love of country is a very, very, very powerful motivator for the vast majority of people. And I think that one of the first duties of any national leader is to do what he or she can to keep the character of our country. And that's not inconsistent with a large immigration program. But if you lose control of your borders, you are not keeping the character of your country. You are subjecting yourselves to what, on a sufficient scale, could easily become a peaceful invasion. And this is the kind of thing that has so worried the people of Europe, and this is the kind of thing that was starting to worry us a great deal back in 2013.
Now it's time for Q&A, and our first question comes from Eugenie Joseph, who's a colleague of mine. She's just written a paper on childcare. Eugenie.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Mr. Abbott, for your remarks. You mentioned in your remarks the need for governments to cut spending and cut taxes, but we recently saw this rather slow and painful death of company tax cuts in the Senate. It really seems that even modest
Speak up, closer.
is impossible in today's age. So what is left as an option to this government? Is the most realistic option another round of personal tax as a way to support the economy and, importantly, to appeal to voters?
Okay, well, I'm in favour of cutting taxes, and if we got personal income tax cuts, I wouldn't be unhappy. I'd be happy. Yes, you've got to do it responsibly, and that's why spending restraint is at the heart of responsible tax cutting. But as I said, I'm not against personal income tax cuts. I'm not against company tax cuts either. In fact, I'm in favour of both. I think it's easier to pursue company tax cuts in a context of broader tax cutting, and let's see what the new government comes up with in that area. I note that very early on in his treasurership, Scott Morrison was talking about more comprehensive tax reform. I'm not saying that that's going to go back onto the table, but certainly that is a sign of his broad disposition, and let's keep watching how the new government develops.
The next question comes from Bruce Watson, who's a member of the IPA, and I'm glad to say he's just joined us as a member of the CIS. Bruce.
It's obviously a very broad church here. Look, thanks, Tony, for such an interesting talk. But in the events of last week, one thing hadn't escaped me, that there's been a bit of a baton change in a generational sense. That being said, and I'm also curious, given you're my local member, what do you see your future is in politics going forward?
Well, that's a very good question. I am very happy to remain your local member, Bruce, provided you continue to vote for me. And, and I think politics, like everything else, should be a blend of youthful exuberance and wisdom and experience. And I certainly think that I continue to have quite a lot to contribute to public life. I think I've got a lot of public life left in me.
Next question from Jacqueline Maley at the Sydney Morning Herald.
Hi, Mr. Abbott. Thanks for the talk. I've just got a question in two parts, if I may. First of all, Kevin Rudd, some comments by Kevin Rudd were published this morning in our newspaper, which he said that you had imposed on the Australian politics unique negativity, toxicity, and hatred. He said that you never cared about policy and that you were a wrecking ball in Australian politics.
Shame.
I just wanted to get your response. Don't shoot the messenger. And secondly, you famously said when Mr. Turnbull took over as Prime Minister that there would be no sniping and no wrecking by you. And I just wanted to see if you would refresh that pledge.
Okay, sure. Well, when Julia Gillard lost the Prime Ministership, I made some sort of ungenerous private comment to some friends of mine, and one of these friends, a very wise person, said to me, "Please, Tony, she is a now and forever afterwards, as far as you're concerned, a respected former Prime Minister." Because he said, one day you will be a former Prime Minister and we want a bit of respect in that area. So look, I'm not going to get into a slanging match with Kevin. He has his views. He's welcome to them. I don't share them, but that's him and this is me.
What about the question of sniping?
As for sniping, now look, it's true that prior to the 2016 election, I wrote 3 pieces for Quadrant in defence of the Abbott government, and given the superabundance of criticism that the Abbott government was getting, I think there are about 5 books in succession, all viciously critical of my government, and I suspect that they'd been written in advance of the demise of the Abbott government, given that they all came out so quickly. Anyway, I wrote 3 modest articles for Quadrant in defence of the Abbott government. Apart from that, I really said nothing prior to the 2016 election.
What about since the 2016 election?
Because I thought it was important to give the new Prime Minister and his government clear air. We all know that it was a disappointing campaign and outcome. After the election, I thought, well, he didn't want me in his cabinet, fair enough, that's the Prime Minister's choice. But as a backbencher, I have a duty not just to do the right thing by my electorate, but where I can, offer some constructive observations about how the government might improve. So I did that. Obviously, I was extremely critical of the so-called National Energy Guarantee. But in the end, even the Prime Minister was critical of the National Energy Guarantee because he dropped it a week ago today. And so I think there's a sense in which my criticisms were vindicated.
Next question, Monica Lewis.
Thank you for your candid comments this afternoon. Just wondering why over the past 5 years we seem to have forgotten about the national debt, and I'm wondering if that conversation will ever be rekindled.
That's a very good question, Monica, and I see the chairman of my former Economic Advisory Council looking very suggestively at me. I see my former chief economist, Dr. Andrew Stone, grinning as well. This is an absolutely critical question. I suppose the problem is that this is one of those areas which is very hard to tackle in the absence of a watershed of some sort, perhaps even a crisis. Once you start talking about a debt in the hundreds of billions of dollars. If you throw everything in, even in the trillions, I think people's eyes start to glaze over. But we all know that if you can't meet your mortgage repayments, you lose your house. We all know that if you can't meet your credit card repayments, all of a sudden it's very hard to meet your daily living expenses. Governments are a bit different in that we trade, I suppose, on the confidence of the international community, and our ability to borrow is backed by sovereign power in a way that corporations and families can't. But nevertheless, in the end, we still have to pay our way in the world. In the end, government cannot spend a dollar that it doesn't raise from you, the citizenry, in taxes, or borrow from you, the citizenry, and people overseas who might be prepared to lend to us. And that means that we have to have the capacity to raise the money to fund our daily expenditure and to pay for our previous expenditure that was based on borrowing by meeting the interest repayment. So we just have to do that. I think that at the very least, what we need to do is to be absolutely disciplined about new spending. And I'm pleased to say that in both of my years as PM, I think in the first year, real spending growth was negative. In the second year, real spending growth was under 1%. It's remained pretty disciplined, but I think there's going to have to be at least as much discipline in the near future as there has been in the recent past.
Next question from April Palmerley, who's head of the Australian American Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you very much for honouring your commitment to speak to us today despite everything that's gone on. I'm struck by the similarity between the Republican Party of 2016 and the Liberal Party today, with so much fighting within the party, not focusing on fighting the opponents. With voters in both countries less supportive of politicians who will compromise, what do you think the party needs to do to win next year?
Well, despite the difficulties that the Republican Party had in 2016, they did win the election. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Donald Trump was a disruptor inside the Republican Party. He was a disruptor in terms of the overall polity, but albeit by a pretty narrow margin, he did win the election. And while there hasn't been a lot of finesse about some of the things that he's done, I would say that on balance, he has done more good than harm, and that this is going to be a significant presidency in the way that not all presidencies are. What we have to do is twofold. We need to reunite, and I think that has largely taken place just in the space of a few short days. And we need to sharpen the policy differences with our opponents. And again, I think that's already happening. So I'm confident that we do now have a better than fighting chance of winning the next election, because even in our most difficult recent days, an enormous number of people, including people who are not our natural supporters, looked at the other side and said, my God, we don't want that. So I think that we now have a pretty good chance of winning the next election. I'm not saying we're favourites by any means, but I think we now are competitive. And as long as you're in the race, you can always win.
Next question, it's Bruce, isn't it?
Yep. Mr. Abbott, the Australian National Audit Office has pointed out to the Electoral Commission on 5 annual reports ending up in 2015 that they are not doing their job. There's a section 99AA2C2, which is an open door for anybody who wants to get on the roll using any name or any address. I've raised this with Malcolm Turnbull. He's done nothing about it. And I believe unless this is corrected, Labor will do what they did in Victoria when they got rid of Dennis Napthine by targeting the marginals and filling it with the help of Get Up and the other friends.
Okay,
What
well-
you reckon should be done?
Well, Bruce, look,
Thanks, Bruce.
You have been a very long time campaigner for electoral law reform, and I thank you for all of your work. I think, I mean, I didn't study the outcome of that particular election as closely as perhaps I should have, but my impression was that it wasn't so much irregular voting, it was more a question of stacking the booths with people purporting to be nurses, fireys and others, and this was the unions up to their usual tricks, rather than people turning up and voting early and voting often, so to speak. But look, I do agree with you that we do have to have a secure roll, and for the life of me, I don't see why you shouldn't have to produce some significant form of ID when you go on the roll and have to produce some form of ID when you turn up to vote. I mean, let's face it, we can't open a bank account these days without producing vast amounts of documentation and verification. Why shouldn't we have to do something to demonstrate who we are before going on the roll? And given that they won't let us on an air flight without showing a photo ID, why don't we at least have to show something before we vote? So I agree with you. The problem always is that to do this probably requires a degree of bipartisanship, and that's often lacking. And it's a second order issue for every government. And it's when you fix the first order issues that you start getting onto the second order issues. And I think that's been the problem, Bruce. It's something that the Howard government would have liked to have done, but never quite got around to it. It's something that I wanted to do, but never quite got around to it. And I'm sure it was something that Malcolm Turnbull would have liked to have done and never quite got around to it. I suspect the Morrison government would like to do it as well. I hope I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth, but there's only probably 9 or 10 months till the next election, and it might be very difficult to get it done, but certainly it should eventually be done.
We have time for at least 2 more questions. Next one from Professor Bruce McKern, formerly at Stanford University in California. Bruce.
Thank you, Tom. Mr. Abbott, I'd like to come back to the question of the broad church for a moment, if we can, because that's been raised quite often today. During the leadership brouhaha, there were a number of commentators, I think Amanda Vanstone was amongst them, saying that the Australian electorate is in the middle and therefore the party has to be in the middle. You've advocated taking positions on key issues that are considered important for the electorate, and I think that's the right direction. But is there any truth in this idea that the Liberal Party has to shift to the left in order to satisfy the middle ground?
Well, if you look at the Liberal Party's great successes under Menzies, under Fraser, and under Howard, we never shifted to the left. If anything, we shifted to the right. Now, you don't want to go sort of too far, but on the other hand, you don't want people to be in any doubt as to what you believe and as to what you're trying to do. And in the end, politics is a contest. And you don't win the contest by saying, well, actually, my policy is the same as that guy's, but I'm better looking or smarter than that guy. You win the contest by saying, well, I might not be the smartest guy, I might not be the best looking and the most charismatic guy in this, but I tell you, I've got these policies that are going to make your life better for this and that other reason. That's what I think you've got to do all the time.
Next, and I think the final question. Sorry, the bright light in my eye, I couldn't quite catch your face. Your name?
Denise.
Denise.
Hi, Tony. I would like to ask you to take a message back to Prime Minister Morrison and the party. Labor's going to come out with an almighty campaign, particularly on health and education. And their answer is throw more money, more money. That isn't the answer. The answer is better educational outcomes, so our children can move from the lower rank right up to
Yeah.
message going to be? It can't be we're going to match that income spending.
I agree with you. I think that we will always struggle to win an auction because we don't really believe in spending more and more when, as you so rightly say, when it comes to education, it's about excellence, not about spending. You can have a great school with pretty ordinary facilities, provided you've got teachers who love their subject, are good with their kids, and you've got kids that are just burning with a curiosity to learn and to get ahead. And so it's those underlying cultural attitudes that are really most important, and that's what we've got to get back to.
I should stress now is as good a time as any to say that CIS has an excellent education program led by Jennifer Buckingham, whom you know, Tony, and Blaise Joseph, among others. And they have emerged as arguably this nation's leading defenders of NAPLAN, but also the leading critics of Gonski 2.0. So follow it up if you're interested. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to run out of time. I'd like to call on my colleague and the head of our Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society program, Jeremy Samet, to make some concluding remarks.
Thanks, Tom. Look, while it's impossible to separate the political events not only of last week but of the last 10 years from the personalities involved, I think it's important for the reasons that we've heard today to focus on what these events also suggest about the bigger political picture. I think that the two most important books on contemporary politics and political disruption in the early 21st century have already been written. And they are Charles Murray's Coming Apart and David Goodhart's The Road to Somewhere. Now, both these books discuss, in the US and the UK respectively, the growing divide in worldviews, aspirations, values, and attitudes to key issues between what is variously termed the elites or the metropolitan sophisticates or sometimes the political class and ordinary suburban voters. Now, the Australian version of these books, which might one day ponder the difference between what we might call the Wentworth and the Warringah views of the world, are yet to be written. But I just want to give a little potted version based on what I think are some of the key issues at the heart, well, what are obviously the key issues at the heart of the political divide in Australia, which are energy and immigration. The political class treats these issues in abstract status terms. What will the so-called international community, i.e. my elite peers in a handful of Western nations around the world, think about Australia/me if we don't cut emissions or if our immigration program isn't large? I don't think that's the way that ordinary voters and ordinary people feel about these issues. For them, the issue is whether they can affordably heat or cool their homes and whether the lights stay on. It's about whether they can afford a home or about how difficult it is to start a family without the security of home ownership. It's also about how long and crowded the journey to work is, and also about the family time that's lost on the commute. Now, these key issues are very ordinary issues, but they're also the issues that are crucial to both the meaning and purpose of life, work, home, and family. And whether we like it or not, the perception and reality is that on these key issues, government policy actions and failures is making life harder. Harder, I think, by distorting the social equation between effort and reward, not only in monetary terms, but also in terms of quality of life. Now, when the response from the political class amounts to saying, just shut your eyes and think of the headline GDP figure, it's no wonder that we're getting political disruption and that people are turning to populist alternatives of all political persuasions that empathise with the grievances but don't really have any solutions. Many commentators also render popular concerns about these issues, such as immigration and the political dynamics they inspire, in abstract terms as a nativist backlash, as reactionary, or as a revolt by the so-called unrepresentative base. Now, the problem with this kind of, I think, tin-eared and pejorative analysis is that it ignores both the ordinariness and the crucial importance of what is behind the present political discontents in societies like Australia and the UK and the US as well. And also those commentators who prefer to shoot the messengers who speak about these issues rather than address the substance of the issues are not only doing a disservice to their fellow citizens, they're also helping to fuel the disruption and polarisation that they otherwise lament. So I would like to thank Mr Abbott for coming here today under difficult circumstances and for discussing some of these questions for us. And I'd also like to thank him for helping the CIS be what it aspires to be, which is a clearinghouse for ideas and issues that some people don't want to discuss, but which we must. Please join me with me in thanking you.
Well done. That's great, mate.